around the room. I can see a few people are ready for lunch, so we'll try and get this one finished on time. As Andrew said, I'm Scott Curtis, a transactional real estate partner at international law firm CMS, and we're here to talk about the rise of the new asset classes, which I think gives very little indication as to what we're actually going to talk about. But what Andrew has tasked us with is looking at how investors are changing and have had to change their views on real estate investment. Now, as a real estate lawyer who specializes in development of various asset classes, my view, naively or self-serving, is build it, repurpose it, redevelop it, and they will come. Thankfully, I've got an expert panel here with me to tell me just how naive I am and how much more difficult it is than that. So let's meet them. Do you want to introduce yourself, Tom? Why don't we start with you?
So my name is Tom Bloxham. I've been working for 40 odd years in real estate, and I started a company called Urban Splash in Manchester, which started doing exactly as you describe, actually. Some of the first people to come in to find redundant space, old warehouses and similar, and move then from doing single buildings to area-wide regeneration. And we've built about 5,000 homes on 60 projects over the last 30 years.
Thank you. Julie.
I'm Husky. I am Julie Fawcett. I'm Chief Executive of Orions, which is an integrated retirement community, part of shall we say, one of the rise of the new asset classes. I was previously Chief Executive of a small private equity hotel chain, and I think that's probably why I'm sitting here, because I have a foot in both camps. And I've also worked quite a lot in consumer-facing businesses through a private equity lens, so...
Thank you.
Consumer champion and real estate.
Hi everyone, Russell Petrie. I am the head of student accommodation for Europe for EQT Exeter, which is the real estate arm of EQT, which is a Swedish-based private equity firm. We're listed on the Swedish Stock Exchange. We have about 240 billion of equity under management globally, so quite a big organization. Our student accommodation portfolio is about 7,500 beds in four different countries. We're looking to grow, looking to do more, and I've been in the space for quite a while, so I can speak to both the UK and the European side of it.
I'm Christian De Zera, leading development for Generator, a hybrid hotel, and also Freehand, upscale lifestyle hotel. We've got 21 assets in Europe and the US, and we're growing further in those countries and also in Middle East and Asia.
Thank you. So let's jump straight in. A nice, easy question to start with. What are investors, prospective investors, saying to you about deploying capital? Tom, should we start with you?
So it's interesting, isn't it? We're talking about beds and sheds is the new thing, and actually, retail offices were the old thing. But the new asset class, actually, it's the most fundamental basic need is shelter, is housing. Housing's been around for absolutely years, and in 1914 in the UK, 80% of it was rented. So it was only through, ironically, the Fair Rent Act that destroyed the rental market in the UK. It's an anomaly in the UK compared with most countries. So at Urban Splash, historically, for the first 25 years or so of the life, we were just building to sell. And what we worked out is actually the people who made most money from our properties wasn't us. It was actually our purchasers who typically built in the first phase of redevelopment schemes and actually saw the capital value go up very strongly. And so having been doing build for sale, I went for a walk with a friend and neighbour of mine who runs a big private equity company investing in infrastructure, and they've raised billions of pounds. And just talking on the walk as you do, you've nothing else to do, was saying the underlying income stream from residential is effectively index-linked, very stable, very steady income, which he said he thought his investors, sovereign wealth funds, big institutions would be interested in doing. And so 5 years ago, from scratch really, we just started it using our own capital, going a couple of rounds to friends and family, and then in 22 got a sovereign on board, the institution, to build up a long-term, open-ended fund for residential for sale. And we're slightly different to a number of the other PRS operators who tend to do very well amenitized big blocks of buildings. And our view is when you're looking to buy a house, what do you want? A really well-designed home in a nice neighborhood. And when you're wanting to rent, I think people want exactly the same thing. So our niche really is really good design. We won 475 awards in great neighborhoods at affordable rents. and our average rents are £1,100 a calendar month, 22% of people's income. So it's trying to find that niche and then attract investor income into it. It was relatively straightforward to find investors. I think it's been a lot harder in the last 12 months or so, with many investors being distracted on other issues. And clearly, when people were getting 0.5% in the bank, then a yield of 4, 5, 6% is interesting, is less interesting now. But what we are finding is real opportunities, particularly in buying existing assets, where vendors are being pressurized into selling. And so some real value-add opportunities. Finding stuff to stack up as new build is still very difficult, making it stack.
Thank you. Russell, coming to you, obviously EQT have the Living Fund. What are the investors saying to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, our lens is a closed-end fund format, so our investors tend to be the large sovereign pension insurance companies of the world. And I think taking their temperature today, I would say it's very lukewarm on real estate in general. The good thing is, probably for everybody in this room, is that the living space, whether it's hotels or resi, tends to be where people want to be. And like Tom said, the offices, the retails, with the more traditional sectors are being closed off. And I think a lot of people have a lot of holes in their existing portfolios that are contributing to some hesitancy to getting back into real estate. But I think it's very attractive, the stuff that we do. And, thankfully, there's not a lot different ways to play it. Student accommodation, the sector I cover, is still quite young, still quite narrow, even compared to BTR generally. So, it's a tough one because they want to be here. They like the space. They like the story. We've proven that the cash flows are inflation hedged over the last few years. That's something we said for 10 years and have only proven in the last couple years. So I think that works really well. The problem is that resi and living can still be quite tight yielding. And there are, when government bonds or cash accounts are paying 5% interest, showing a 4.5% student yield in London is just not that attractive on a global competitive basis. So I think the good thing is for those who have real estate allocations, I think living mops that up quite easily, but the kind of forward momentum is still a little stalled.
Thank you. Christian, Generator.
On my side, I would say it's we get different views from investors where the dependence on the interest rates. So whereas in the US, where you're getting 9% plus, and in Europe it's a lot lower, that can make an impact on what decisions are made, or whether you do a conversion, new build, or does the numbers stack up, which then leads to build costs. Build costs in London are very difficult to make a deal work, whereas in Dublin it's a bit better and a lot more attractive in, say, Portugal. Then I think another point which we're finding a lot of traction with investors is the interest is more about the region or the market in Europe rather than whether it's what brand we're going to put on there. So a lot of interest in Spain or Portugal as opposed to other countries where interest rates are higher or build costs like London are too high. So those are some of the things I'm seeing.
Thank you. And Julie, it's your uber successful scheme. I'm sure your investors are
They're delighted.
desperate.
Absolutely delighted. My investors saying what all investors saying, which is, we'll take all the operational risk, but please can we have opportunistic scale returns? And that's how they start. However, it's obviously a much more nuanced and partnership conversation than that. And we are at Orions and any IRC developer sitting on a huge potential tailwind, and I use the word potential advisedly. So we've got a well-publicised demographic time bomb, we've got a shortage of residential accommodation, and we've also got a reasonable data set around the impact of integrated retirement communities, positive impact on social care and health, both outcomes and costs. There's a lot of really good stuff sitting behind that. So what's the problem? So the problem is twofold. Firstly, we have a consumer story to tell. So once you have a consumer inside an integrated retirement community, they get the joke. They're advocates. We just recently had a net promoter score from our existing residents that was off the charts, and I don't think that was entirely because we're good. I think a lot of it was because they are enjoying the experience of living out that part of their life in that way. So we have a consumer challenge to face down, and that's problem number one, which finds its way into things like really, really important numbers that you put into your investment appraisal, like rate of sale. And the second problem we have is our financial model has a huge amount of deferred revenue, and that confers an enormous amount of risk. And how you price all of that, and how you understand all of that, and how you get the data behind all of that has got everybody scratching their heads. One of the things that I hear a lot, and I see a lot across other industries, is sort of lack of collaboration around data. That's not actually the case in this industry. It's a very, very collaborative industry, but the data sets just aren't big enough and substantial enough for institutional capital to get really comfortable.
Interesting. Because there was a session earlier that was talking about institutional coming in, potentially flooding the market for the best assets, but that's interesting. There was a question in one of the earlier sessions that I liked. If I gave you 200 million, how would it be deployed? I'll slightly change it and say, let's look beyond the interest rate environment we're in. Let's look, imagine that build cost has sorted itself out. What are investors going to be looking at in your particular sector in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, and what's going to attract them to your sector as opposed to potentially one of the other sectors of the people that are sat on this panel? Christian, why don't we start with you?
Would say having that ability, if an investor could, I think it would be scaling.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the larger things that are happening is, yes, you can go and take a conversion, like Tom is saying, which a lot of people are looking to go and convert either an office building to a hotel or reposition an existing asset. Where we get approached a lot would be where they're not office buildings, they're warehouses, universities, prisons, etc. But if you now have scalability that your brand or product can get into a lot more in those capital cities, plus go into secondary cities, you're going to become quite attractive. On top of that, if you're a product that can be flexible, so whereas some, if I'm using hotel product rather than some of the asset classes, have rigidity that they can only fit a certain box, whereas at Generator especially, we can work with any type of building or class subject to planning, and that can be used more. We get a lot of attention. So some random warehouse in Portugal or Italy where there is no scope of value add for the building, but it can be done for a generator, we get attraction for that. So coming back to the scalability, if you can, now an investor can say, right, we've got a plethora of money, but we can really grow you into the more of the capital cities and secondaries with any building subject to planning. I get a lot of calls.
Interesting. And Russell, I do quite a bit of work in the student sector. We're starting to see that sort of consolidation in the UK. Is that something that you're looking at and that investors are going to be looking at in the student space?
Yeah, I think if you take the UK as an example, there's been a bifurcation of the investable cities and the uninvestable cities. And we've got a bit of a mantra that we want to be in the places where it's harder to build, because we've seen over time that rental growth is strongest in cities where planning is difficult, there's good alternative use options, means there's a natural supply moat, which means if you have assets there, you could enjoy quite a good position. So yeah, that's kind of a key theme that we're seeing throughout. And I think investors are very in tune with the demand side of the story. And we throw up charts all the time. Demand is going up and to the right, and supply is going down and to the right. every year. So, the good thing in the student space is that the tenant story is very strong, the rental growth is very strong, the NOI is very predictable, we've got good inflation hedge. So all of that is very positive. Where we see weaknesses, again, in the capital market side of it. So volatility in cap rates, volatility in debt pricing, liquidity in debt is very, very strong. But investors do not like uncertainty. So whether we stay where we are, interest rates go up, down, they just kind of need to show some leveling off in some sense so that we can kind of get back to business, because then we can underwrite it with confidence and show credible kind of business plans to investors.
Scott, could I add, as Russell was talking about student assets, one other piece that we get approaches from, because Generator has the 16 to 30-year-old student, younger generation, we get approaches on some buildings where, can you put they got like 2 sites within one master plan, can we put a generator and then consider putting a student asset branded as a generator? Now, not a remit that we have at Generator at the moment, but I think it's a good option of how Generator or any of the hotel brands can enter into a second asset class whilst taking advantage of a brand that fits that.
Yep.
So imagining now you have a PBSA building which is branded Generator would be a good fit to extend your portfolio for scaling again.
It's something that from the outside looking in, I think it's quite obvious. The sectors are different, but have very many similarities, and yet everybody does something slightly different. What surprises me is that one of the bigger, more established brands, potentially starting with the hospitality, hasn't jumped on to, maybe they've done some branded living stuff in Dubai where it's sexy, but why are they not jumping into branded PBSA in London, branded senior living? Julie, any thoughts on is it just too young a sector at the moment to be doing that?
So I think going back to your original question, if you had 200 million, what would you spend it on?
Fair enough.
Well, I'm going to link it because that's what, stick with me.
Yeah.
We've all got 200 million, basically. Everybody sitting here has got access to that kind of capital, and we're spending it in our sector, and that's the point. There's enough capacity in our sectors to fulfill those needs. That's why we're in them. So I think that's one of the reasons why it hasn't switched across. Taking the questions where I wanted to take it, if I had 200 million to create value, I wouldn't spend it on any asset class. I would spend it on fixing the things that get in our way. And the biggest one of those right now is planning and the legislative environment that we operate in. And so I'd buy myself a lot of lobbyists and feed them well, send them out. That's what I'd do.
Need more than 200 million to do that, I think.
Yeah.
Or maybe spend the 200 million on some good architects and city architects to take control of our city a bit better. For me, I think the real opportunity and the opportunity that we're trying to sell to investors is one of scale. And the residential lettings market in the UK is bigger than any other business in the UK. It's bigger than the commercial business. It's 6 times the size of the hotel business. It's 20 times the size of the student business. It's bigger than the automotive business and the retail business, any other business. And yet, there's no, 3% of it is owned by institutions, and there are no brands. And the analogy I use is when my grandparents stayed in a hotel, they stayed in the Town Hall Tavern or the Railway Hotel. Today, when you stay in a hotel, you stay in the Four Seasons or the W or Soho House or Travelodge or Premier Inn. When I went to university, I stayed in a terraced house. Kids today go and stay with Unite or Vito, whoever it be. It's all branded, but there are no brands in residential. And what we're trying to create is a brand that's actually recognisable. And I think there's a couple of things that are important. The most important one is the trust of the consumer. And most people, when they're renting, they don't even know who owns it. They're dealing with intermediaries. The service is often mediocre, sometimes very bad. And actually having a brand that is known, that is responsible, they know what the product is, they know what the service is, alongside the frictionless service. On the frictionless service, I use the example of opening a bank account. When you used to open a bank account, you'd go into your bank, you need 2 forms of proof of address, you've got to fill in these forms, you've got to wait 4 weeks. Today, you go on your phone and open a Revolut account or wherever in a second. The same with actually renting an apartment. It's a pain in the backside. Any of you or your friends have done it. You've got to wait for a listing. You've got to turn up for viewing at the time of the agent's choice. Half the time it's gone before then. Then you actually go and have a look at it. If you like it and it's not gone, you do your credit check. It takes weeks. It's a vision that we've got where everybody is pre-referenced. You know exactly what you can afford and can't afford. You can look at what you're looking for on your phone app when a flat comes available. You come and look at it. You look at it at the time of your choosing. The code comes through on your phone. You get in there. We know who you are. We've got your credit card. If you don't like it, you tell us why you don't like it. We send you some better choice. If you like it, you press a button and bang, you've got the contract. You can move in the next day. So I think it's a combination of the service and the brand and the platform being integrated and a pipeline of land enables huge potential to expand in the residential side.
Interesting. And going back to the point that Julie mentioned about planning, I mean, I think we could spend hours moaning about the planning system in various countries. But it's interesting because often one of the things that is said about the living sector in particular and the different areas you work in is the constant regulatory changing environment. And we are in a ever-changing political environment, but where we are now is obviously we've got elections in the UK, elections in France, recent elections for the European Parliament, and who knows what's going to go on with the ripples or waves from across the pond. So, slightly unfair question, I appreciate, just before lunch, but without any party affiliation or anything, or it doesn't need to be UK-centric, what's keeping you awake at night from a political perspective? Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Go for it.
I guess student accommodation, because the international component of our demand pool is so important, political risk is our kind of biggest external threat. So, you know, when political parties are talking about capping student visas, cutting down on post-study work placement or stay time, that is detrimental. And I think it's a real own goal in a sense because, you know, education is a huge exporter of soft power, a huge GDP grower, huge propper up of some call it secondary and tertiary cities in whatever country in Europe. It's a big employer. So to limit that and put it to not champion that sector, I think is really problematic. I'm self-interested as well. But you know, it's probably the single most biggest issue is waking up one morning, reading in the headlines that, you know, student visas have been scrapped. You would see a lot of unhappy people in the student accommodation space, and I think a lot of business plans, especially for those who target the very high-end product, would be in a lot of trouble. So that for me is the single biggest risk.
I think I could add how the moratoriums of Barcelona, Amsterdam, and if that continues further in Europe, like Paris, it's beginning to see signs of how they're putting a block on hotels permissions. In Dublin, there's a risk of new hotel permissions going in, and if that continues further in other major cities, I think that's a big risk factor.
I think there's the biggest risk that we've got going into this election is that we don't have enough strength in the government, and we end up with a bunch of sops to some of the...
Wondered where you were going with that, Julie.
Well, we end up with a bunch of sops to things that aren't actually good for the country, which is really where we've got into a pretty difficult situation today. And there's some potential risks in that. For example, for us, leasehold reform becomes a political football rather than making good decisions about what's right to increase availability of housing and, you know, all the things that it needs to do. So if we don't have enough strength in this parliament, we'll end up with them having to play those games, which is just will be rubbish for everybody.
For me, it's a bit of stability, please. I think I've met 26 different housing ministers in my time. Every single one's told me they're going to build their 300,000 homes a year and going to sort out planning. Every single one's actually made the situation worse. And an end to knee-jerk reactions. You know, we were hearing before about the Building Safety Act. many other countries survive quite safely without things like that. That is going to have the net effect of just stopping people developing over 18 metres. It makes so many complications, so many risks. And many of the schemes we do are 20 and 30-year long-term strategic plans working in partnership with the local authority. And you're working around a finance schedule of 3 to 5 years, a political schedule of 5 years, with schemes, master planning schemes taking 20 years, and buildings, if we get it right, will last for hundreds of years. Yeah. And so there's a disconnect there that England's been famous and been great for stable government, stable legislation. And in the last few years, we've just seen these knee-jerk reactions that seem to be harming all sorts of things.
Thank you. Well, we've still got a few minutes left, so plenty of time to take some audience questions. I'm sure there will be some. There you go. Gentleman over there.
Hi, I have a question for Julie. What is the average age of someone entering into one of your residences, and what is the average length of stay?
The average length of stay across the sector is 7 years, roughly. Mm-hmm. And we're a rarefied group, but our average age is 82 point something. So, but we've got a relatively small population at the moment.
So 82, you
82
said?
is our average.
When they enter,
something,
when they enter.
Sorry, no, that's the current age. So they'd be a couple of years younger than that when they enter.
Okay.
Another question over here, Andrew.
Over here. Sorry.
Thank you. Also a question for Julie about retirement homes. My company is a bit involved in the space, and also my father is in one in the U.S. And what I see is that typically the financing of it is that the couple or the person will sell their primary home to pay for the retirement home. So what happens when the primary home market's a bit frozen, where young people can't buy because of interest rates, because of high costs of housing? So is there just enough, are there enough wealthy retirement people to just pay out of pensions, or how much risk is there in this sort of transfer of wealth that they need, that capital from their primary home to fund these very nice retirement facilities?
I think the principle of what's happening is very straightforward, which is you're basically selling into the market your family home, which you no longer need, which is probably quite burdensome to maintain and costly to maintain and isolating to live in, and exchanging that for a purchase of a smaller unit that is broadly maintained for you, or it's certainly much easier to maintain and manage, inside a community which nurtures you as is right for your stage of life. It counters loneliness, any social needs and health needs you might have able to be met within that community, but you're not living in a nursing home environment, and it will stop you having to go into nursing care about 9 times out of 10. So I'm not sure that there's a massive risk. There is, I think, to your point, a challenge around the overall liquidity because all of that requires that cycle to function. Like the whole piece has to work. It has to be affordable right at the bottom so that the ecosystem can flow. And that, I think, is a challenge. And until we solve I think it's one of the challenges that we don't talk about often enough. Until we solve affordability for first-time buyers down here and create liquidity for them, we're probably not going to get our cycle flowing at pace.
For the student and generator, what on a ground-up scheme, what would win out between the student and generator freehand?
What would win out?
Yeah, what would derive most value if you've got a ground-up scheme?
I would say if it's proper prime to super prime, generator's going to win every time, because the rents they can get on a per square foot basis are better than what I have, and as London maybe being an outlier, anywhere else, there's kind of an inherent affordability cap for student accommodation. I think as you go a little bit further out of those prime locations, that dynamic might shift a little bit, because my pricing tends to be in a band, whether you're 10 feet from the city center or 5K from the city center. So it'll tail off a bit, but I suspect that the hospitality rents will really tail off because they're not willing to live in those more suburban areas.
Thank you, Russell.
Final question down the front,
We went down
Andrew. We've got time for one more.
Need to coordinate where the questions are asked from.
He's having a workout.
About a throwing arm.
Thank you. I see a great opportunity for a sort of a cradle-to-grave proposition on stage here. Is that something you're considering, sort of a living as a service? Because I think that, as the lady has said, I mean, there's a lot of young people who have got trouble getting into the market, and that might preclude them from sort of some of the later opportunities that you also offer.
Certainly our ambition in the long term, when we're doing big placemaking schemes of 1,000+ homes, is to have it fully integrated. And actually, often, the difference physically between what you're developing and what we're developing is not dissimilar. I remember my grandmother lived in the McCarthy Stone one, and basically had quite a horrible lounge full of old people. You have a restaurant on the ground floor, which is used by everybody, having a school and young kids next to some elderly accommodation. And it's very symbiotic, and actually the elderly people are more mature, can look after the gardens, do different things, and to be able to be in the same place. So you start in a studio apartment. As you actually get older and wealthier, you can move to 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom, move back down. You've got GP surgery on site to provide basic health support. So I think there's a really interesting model of actually a development where you can live from cradle to grave. Perhaps the best example of that working, ironically, is where I live in London, which is in the Barbican Estates. And if you look there, again, you've got all sorts of sizes of people, all sorts of different people, all sorts of services on site in the and a school and an art gallery, and doctors and dentists, and I think it functions quite well.
We cross-sell. We've got other living products in kind of the same cities as our student stuff, so we cross-sell that as much as we can. I would say that it'd be hard to do you have to be in massive scale, because where you want to be a student is not necessarily where you want to be as a young professional, is not where you want to retire, unless you've got kind of the big master plan that can kind of speak to all those different elements. So, if you're doing kind of one-off investments, it might drag you into different locations. So our BTR portfolio, for example, is in London, is in zones 3+, which might make sense for a student who wants to live a little bit more centrally while they're a student, and then get something a bit more affordable out of town. But I suspect they'd want to be, if you're willing to pay to be in central London as a student, you kind of want to stay centrally as a young professional as well. But absolutely, there's a lot of potential there. There's one more up here if we have time.
Go for it.
Thank you, Andrew. This is Navneet Bali. I have a question for Russell and then also for Chris, because I told him I'll ask him a question. No, the question is, you mentioned just now how the profit per square meter would be higher in a transient accommodation like Generator in a city center location, and therefore I understand that. What do you think of the student hotel model, the TSH? Is it quite successful? Is that something you've considered, or you think that's a one-off?
So that was just an idea purely because Russell's here and talking about PBSA, and because we've had approaches from developers, owners, where they have sites that have scope for a generator, but there is consent on the site that also has PBSA. And would we, as Generator, consider putting a Generator branded PBSA? So this is not a remit from Generator that's going out to the market, but it's been an approach because the natural evolution from a Generator branded product for 16 to 30-year-olds to then have an asset next door or within the same platform that is branded Generator, that's servicing the same target market and providing, and on our operating platform, makes sense to grow that. And if you look at the PBSA market is quite strong in the UK, away from most of European cities. So if we were to do that in some of the key university markets of the UK, that could be a good business case.
So the TSH example, the social hub they're known now, started life as a student housing business to get around Dutch short-term rental laws. They went with hotel licenses and put students in there. What they found was that they could make way more money selling it as a hotel than as students. They are now a hotel business. And if people don't want to be in hotels, it's because of COVID, because they saw their revenues go to zero overnight. Because as you dial up intensification on a square foot basis, you dial down safety and security and tenure of income. So people like student because I reset every year. People like retirement living because it's every 3 years. People like BTR, PRS, because it can be 3 to 5 years kind of maximum stay. So your intensification and your safety of income are counterbalanced a little bit, whereas hotels can quickly go to zero. Which is the problem.
Sorry, it wasn't me trying to get you to stop talking. I promise. But we are out of time. It is lunchtime. Thank you very much.